April 12th, 1981. Cabin 28. Keddie, California. 4 people were killed inside that cabin. 3 children were in the next room. No one has ever been convicted. And more than 4 decades later, that case remains officially unsolved. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It wasn't random. And when you slow the details down carefully, it becomes very hard to ignore how many opportunities this investigation had to get it right. So this episode, we're reopening Cabin 28. Keddie sat in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Plumas County, Northern California. It was originally built as a resort town. It was a collection of rental cabins near a railroad line. In the 1970s and early 80s, it wasn't thriving. Tourism had declined, cabins were aging, some were occupied by long-term renters, some by seasonal workers. It wasn't an isolated wilderness, but it wasn't a tight suburban neighborhood either. People kept to themselves. Cabin 28 was positioned near the center of the resort property. Wooden structure, modest size, small living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a back hallway. Thin walls, wood floors. If you raised your voice in one room, it carried. And that matters. In 1979, Sue Sharp moved there from Connecticut with her 5 children. She was separating from her husband. It was a reset. Lower cost of living, distance from the East Coast, a fresh start. For 2 years, it was uneventful. Until April 11th, 1981. Saturday, Sue was home. Her son John, who was 15, was there. His friend Dana Wingate, who was 17, was staying over. Tina Sharp, who was 12, was home. The 3 younger boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, were in the back bedroom. Sheila Sharp, who was 14, was spending the night with a friend in another cabin. The day didn't stand out. There were no reported arguments, no visible tension, no signs of fear. Neighbors later said they just saw normal activity that evening. Lights on, movement inside. But at some point between approximately 10:30 p.m. and 2 a.m., at least 2 attackers entered Cabin 28. That window was important, because the events that followed were not quiet. Investigators determined that Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate were attacked in the living room. There were signs of binding the victims with medical tape and electrical cord. A bent steak knife was recovered. A hammer was believed to have been used. The victims were moved, and that suggests control. This was not a single explosive moment of violence. It was sustained. And yet, 3 boys in the back bedroom were physically unharmed. They slept through it in a wooden cabin, with a violent struggle happening just mere feet away from them. Detail doesn't sit well with me. Not because it's impossible, but because it complicates everything. About 7 a.m., Sheila came back home. She entered the front door and saw the living room. She ran to a neighbor's cabin. The law arrived shortly thereafter. Tina Sharp was missing, though. Initially, investigators thought they were working a triple homicide and a kidnapping. 3 years later, though, in 1984, Tina's remains were discovered about 50 miles away in Butte County. Partial skeletal remains. The case shifted to a quadruple homicide. From the beginning, issues surfaced. The cabin was not secured properly. Multiple civilians entered before full containment. Potential evidence contamination happened. The hammer believed to have been used was never conclusively recovered. One suspect handed law enforcement a hammer shortly after the murders. It wasn't properly tested. That's not speculation. That is documented. The handling of physical evidence in the first 48 hours of a homicide investigation most often determines whether a case survives long term. Cabin 28, first 48 hours were a mess. Interviews were conducted, statements were taken, but documentation was very inconsistent. Chain of custody for certain items became very blurry. There were early suspicions of specific individuals, but no immediate arrests. And momentum matters in a homicide case. Once it slips, it very seldom ever fully returns. Martin Smart lived in cabin 26 with a very clear view of cabin 28. He had a history of volatility. His wife later said that he returned home that night acting very strangely. Years later, she even said he confessed involvement in the murders. But the alleged confession was never recorded at the time it was supposedly made. He gave them a hammer. It was not conclusively linked to the crime. He was never charged. And he died in 2000. Officially, he remains a suspect. Unofficially, the case stalled around him. Joseph Bobby was known to associate with Smart. He also fell under suspicion. But suspicion is not evidence. And without preserved forensic work, suspicion cannot evolve into prosecution. He died in 1988. Two primary suspects, both deceased. No charges ever filed. Now, if you're new here, this is what we do. We slow cases down. We look at where investigations lost their footing. If that matters to you, subscribe. Because there are more like this. Now back to the missing pieces. The bindings. The number of attackers. The missing hammer. The delayed testing of evidence. The demolition of cabin 28 in 2004. When a crime scene disappears physically, public memory naturally fades with it. But unresolved cases don't fade for families. They stagnate. In 2013, a new sheriff reopened the case. So fresh eyes, fresh review. Analysis of evidence. Modern DNA testing possibilities. In 2016, a skull fragment was re-examined for viable DNA, and hope resurfaced. But no arrest followed. Which raises a procedural question. Was there never enough evidence? Or was there evidence that lost integrity early? Those are not the same problem. Now, based on documented evidence, this was likely targeted. Multiple attackers were likely involved. There was familiarity with the layout, and there was control during the attack. This does not resemble a spontaneous burglary. It resembles a planned confrontation that escalated. That doesn't assign guilt. It assigns probability. As years pass, witness memory deteriorates. Physical evidence degrades. Suspects die. Even if investigators know what likely happened, knowing and proving are two different standards. And in Cabin 28, the distance between those two standards widened early. 3 children slept in the next room. 4 people never walked out of Cabin 28. 2 primary suspects are dead. The cabin itself is gone. But procedural failures remain part of the record. Someone knows what happened in that living room. Maybe they suspected. Maybe they were told. Maybe they were there. And if they're still alive, they've carried that knowledge for over 40 years. If cases like this deserve careful review, not dramatics, not speculation, but careful review, subscribe, enable notifications, and share this channel, because there are more investigations that have lost their footing. And sometimes what was missed matters more than what was found. This has been the Pine Grove Briar. And until next time, keep your pipes lit and your powder dry.